I hadn't expected anyone to be at the cabin when I pulled up that afternoon, least of all Mark. I'd come because Jonah, my best friend, told me his dad's water pump had been making a rattling noise all week and that if I didn't mind I could take a look. I'd been here dozens of times growing up, summers, winters, birthdays, but the place had always been folded around the noise of their family. Warm, chaotic, lived in. That day it felt still. Too still. I pushed open the cabin door with the familiar creak in the hinges, ready to call out for an empty house. Instead I froze halfway inside. Mark stood in the kitchen, barefoot, holding a chipped mug of coffee. He turned at the same moment I spotted him, and for a heartbeat we both stared like neither of us trusted what we were seeing. "Eli?" he said, blinking as though pulling himself from somewhere far away. I stepped fully inside, suddenly aware of how loud my boots sounded against the old wood floor. Jonah said I could come check the pump. Oh. His brows furrowed, then smoothed into something like embarrassment. Right. He never mentioned you were coming today. He set the mug down. The sound echoed just a little too sharply in the quiet. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year, not since right after the divorce when Jonah was splitting his time between home and the dorms. Back then Mark had looked exhausted, frayed at the edges. Now he looked different. Not better exactly, but softer in a way that caught me off guard. His hair had grown out and curled slightly at his temples. His t-shirt hung loosely, sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms I didn't remember being that strong. He looked less like my best friend's dad and more like a man who'd been living alone long enough to forget how to hide the tenderness under everything. I swallowed. I didn't know you were here. Jonah said you'd been staying in the city more. He gave a short, quiet laugh, the kind someone makes when the truth is heavier than the joke. I've been coming up here a lot. Helps clear my head. After a beat, he added, or that's what I tell people anyway. He leaned back against the counter, arms crossing. I thought he might say more, but instead his eyes drifted over me in a way that wasn't quite casual. They paused on my damp hair, it had started to drizzle on the drive. Then on my hands. Then back to my face, slower this time. I felt my heartbeat pick up, stupidly. This was Mark. Jonah's father. The guy who used to drive us to soccer practice in a minivan full of empty coffee cups and mismatched cleats. "Do you want something to drink?" he asked. "Coffee? Water?" I shook my head, setting my tool bag down by the door. "I should probably look at the pump before it gets dark." He nodded once but didn't move. His eyes held on a second too long, like he was trying to read something in me, or like he wanted to say something he wasn't sure he had the right to voice. I brushed past him toward the basement door, expecting him to return to whatever he'd been doing. Instead he followed. The stairs groaned under our weight, the air growing cooler and denser as we descended. Dust floated in the strip of sunlight seeping through the tiny basement window. The pump sat in the far corner, humming with the uneven rhythm Jonah had described. I crouched down to inspect it. Mark stood behind me for a moment, then quietly lowered himself to sit on the bottom step. "You don't have to stay down here," I said, glancing back. "I know." His tone was soft. "Just figured, it's been a while since I had company." Something in the way he said it pulled at me. Not pity, more like recognition. Like I understood loneliness more than I wanted to admit. I turned back to the pump, pretending to focus. But I felt his gaze on me. Not intrusive, just present. Observing. Almost grateful. When I tightened the first screw, it slipped from my cold fingers and clattered onto the concrete. Before I could reach for it, Mark bent forward, picked it up and held it out. Our hands brushed when I took it. Barely a whisper of contact, but enough to send a quick jolt through me. He looked at me then. Really looked. Not like a father looking at his son's friend. Not like someone making small talk to fill silence. Something else. Something I didn't have words for yet. "You've grown up a lot," he said quietly. I let out a short breath. "It's been a few years." "Yeah." A pause, weighted but warm. Guess I missed more of it than I realized. The hum of the pump filled the space between us, but neither of us moved to break the moment. It lingered, not heavy, not awkward. Just suspended. Waiting. After a long stretch of quiet, Mark exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. "Well," he said, attempting a lighter tone, "before you fix that thing you might have to fix me first. I've been a little all over the place lately." He smiled like it was a joke, but the honesty behind it sat thick in the air. And for the first time since walking into the cabin, I realized the night wasn't going to be simple. It felt like something had already shifted, subtly, undeniably, in the way he looked at me. By the time I diagnosed what was wrong with the pump, a loose valve and a couple of rusted fittings, the basement had grown colder. The only warm thing in the room was Mark, sitting on the step with his elbows on his knees, watching me like he wasn't sure how to stop. "I'll have to replace this piece," I said, tapping the old valve. "But the hardware store in town should still be open." Mark nodded slowly, though it looked like he'd drifted away in his thoughts again. "I'll drive you." "You don't have to," I said. "It's a 5-minute walk." "That wasn't the question," he replied gently. He stood, his knees cracking softly as he straightened. When he offered me a hand to help me up, I almost didn't take it. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was suddenly, absurdly aware of how much I did. But he kept his hand extended, patient, steady. So I took it. His palm was warm, firm, calloused at the base of his fingers. He pulled me up with one smooth motion, and for one suspended second we were too close, closer than anyone who wasn't supposed to be something should ever be. I stepped back first. Or maybe he did. I can't remember, the air felt too thick. We went upstairs together, and for a few minutes everything returned to normal, or what passed for normal in a quiet cabin with someone you weren't supposed to notice. But then the sky opened. Rain hammered the windows and sheets, turning the path to town into a blur of water. Mark glanced outside and exhaled. "Well, so much for the hardware store. I can still work with what's here," I said. "It just might get a little messy." He raised an eyebrow. "Messy how?" I gestured toward the basement. "Pressure release. If I loosen the wrong thing too fast we might get sprayed." He laughed, the first real laugh I'd heard from him since arriving. "All right then. Let's get messy." We went back down. Mark insisted on helping, even though I tried to convince him it wasn't necessary. The basement was cramped, and the pump sat against the wall in a way that forced us to work shoulder to shoulder. Literally. Every time I reached forward, my elbow brushed his. Every time he leaned in to shine the flashlight, his breath skimmed the side of my neck. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't flirtatious. It was something more alarming, unconscious, natural, like our bodies had decided proximity wasn't negotiable. I tried not to think about it. I failed. At one point Mark crouched beside me, arm extended over my shoulder, flashlight angled perfectly toward the rusted bolt I was loosening. His hand hovered inches from my chest. His knee touched mine. And the smell of him, cedar, laundry soap, something warm beneath it, curled so gently around me it almost broke my concentration. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, even though my pulse was too loud in my ears to call myself okay. "Yeah. Just trying not to break anything. Don't worry." His voice dipped softer. "I trust you." Something about the way he said it made me pause. But before I could ask what he meant, the bolt gave. And the pipe exploded. A full burst of cold water shot straight into my face, soaking my shirt, splattering across the floor. I sputtered in shock, blinded for a second. I heard Mark shout my name, not loud but urgent, and then his hands were gripping my waist, yanking me backward before I could lose balance. I landed against him. His chest pressed into my back. His arms locked around me, steadying me even after the water pressure died down. For a moment neither of us moved. His breath was warm against my ear. Mine came too fast. His hands, they didn't leave my waist right away. They lingered, fingers curling unconsciously against the fabric of my drenched shirt. "Sorry," he murmured, voice low, almost strained. "You okay?" Yeah. My own voice didn't sound like mine. Just surprised. He exhaled, slow, and I felt the breath travel down my spine. Then he seemed to realize how close we were because his hands withdrew, not abruptly but reluctantly, like he'd remembered something he wasn't supposed to want. The basement was soaked, the floor puddled, the air colder than before. Mark's shirt clung to him now, outlining muscle and old scars I'd never noticed. He glanced down at himself, then at me, and for the first time that day, there was no guardedness in his expression. Just awareness. And something quiet, fragile, dangerous. "We're both drenched," he said, voice softer than the rain above us. We should get changed." I nodded, but neither of us moved for another long moment. We stood there dripping, breathing unevenly, staring in a way that wasn't accidental anymore. It was too close to be nothing. Too close not to mean something. We changed in separate rooms, but the separation didn't help. If anything, it made everything louder, the sound of the rain, the memory of his hands on my waist, the way his breath had grazed my neck. I stood in Jonah's old room, peeling off my soaked shirt, staring at the flannel Mark had tossed me earlier. It smelled faintly like him. I tried not to think about that. I failed. When I finally stepped out, the cabin felt different. Warmer, somehow. Quieter. Mark was in the living room, sitting on the couch with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like the answer to something complicated was carved into the wood grain. He looked up when he heard me. His eyes lingered, first on the too big flannel hanging loose on my shoulders, then on my face. I pretended not to notice the second look. "You okay?" he asked softly. "Yeah," I said. "You?" He let out a breath, rubbed the back of his neck. "Been better. Been worse." Something about the honesty of that made me walk toward him instead of away. I sat on the opposite end of the couch, though it felt like the center of the entire room was the space between us. We stayed like that for a while, not talking, just listening to the rain and the low groan of the old cabin settling. I should have said something. Anything. But I was afraid of choosing the wrong words, afraid of choosing the right ones. Mark was the one who broke the silence. "You know," he said, voice low, "this place used to never be quiet. Jonah and his friends were always here. You especially." I smiled despite myself. "You used to complain about us leaving muddy footprints everywhere." "I didn't mind the footprints," he said. "I minded the noise when it stopped." I turned toward him, but he didn't look at me. He was staring at his own hands, clasped loosely between his knees, knuckles pale. "I don't think people tell you," he continued, "how lonely it gets when a house goes quiet. How it echoes." The rain softened outside, turning into a gentle pattering under the eaves. His voice dropped to match it. "After the divorce," he said, "everyone kept saying I'd get used to it, that it'd just take time. But it's been a year and I still haven't." He swallowed. "Sometimes I think I'm not meant to." I shifted closer before I realized I was doing it. Not much, just a few inches, but enough that I could feel the subtle warmth coming off him. "Mark," I said quietly, "you're not broken." He let out a soft, humorless laugh. "I feel like it." "You're not," I repeated. "You're human." Finally, slowly he looked at me. His eyes were tired, but there was something behind them I hadn't seen before. Not just sadness. Not just gratitude. Something searching. "Eli," he said, and my name felt different coming from him. Like an exhale that had been trapped too long. "Why does it feel easier to talk to you than anyone else?" I didn't have an answer. Not one that made sense out loud. So I didn't say anything. He didn't seem to mind. Silence settled again, but it didn't feel empty this time. It felt full. Full of everything we weren't saying. Full of breaths that caught in our throats. Full of truths I wasn't ready to look it straight on. After a moment he leaned back, resting against the cushions. His arm brushed mine as he moved, barely but enough that I felt it in places that had nothing to do with nerves. I shifted closer. Or maybe he did. It happened so naturally I couldn't tell. We sat there like that, not touching but close enough that if either of us breathed just a little deeper we would be. Eventually Mark spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. "It's strange," he said. "You grow up being told that everything gets simpler with age. But it doesn't. It just gets quieter. And sometimes the quiet is the worst part." I hesitated, then said softly, "Sometimes quiet means something's about to change." His gaze drifted from the window back to me. "Is that what this feels like to you?" he asked. I didn't trust myself to answer. Instead, I offered him the only truth I could manage without unraveling. "It feels like something." He stared at me for a long moment, long enough that I wondered if I'd gone too far. But the look in his eyes wasn't confusion. Or discomfort. It was relief. Like I'd said something he'd been afraid to admit to himself. "Yeah," he murmured. "Me too." The room felt smaller after that. The rain softer. The distance between us thinner. We didn't touch. We didn't confess anything. But when he leaned his head back and let his shoulder rest against mine, just barely, just enough to be intentional, neither of us moved away. And somehow that silence said more than any words could. We must have stayed on that couch longer than either of us intended. The rain softened into quiet drips along the gutters, and the light outside dimmed until the windows reflected the room back at us in soft, darkened shapes. Yet neither of us stood. Neither of us tried to change the subject or break the fragile calm we'd found. Eventually Mark cleared his throat. "You hungry?" I wasn't, not really, but I nodded anyway. It felt like a chance to breathe, to move, to steady myself before the weight of everything between us collapsed into something I couldn't name. He stood first. I followed him into the small kitchen, where he opened a cabinet and pulled down a box of pasta like he'd done it 1,000 times. I watched his hands as he moved, slow, deliberate, almost careful. Not like a man cooking. More like a man trying not to think too much. "You cooked for us all the time," I said softly. "Jonah and me." He laughed under his breath. "Yeah. You two were bottomless pits. Half my grocery budget went into feeding you. And you never complained." I complained plenty. You just didn't hear me. His smile lingered as he turned back to the stove. For a few moments he looked lighter, not unburdened, but warmed by some old memory that softened the lines around his eyes. While the water boiled, I leaned against the counter beside him. The flannel he'd lent me was warm now from my body heat, and I realized I didn't want to take it off. It felt like wearing a piece of him. I didn't notice how close I was standing to him until he reached past me to grab a wooden spoon from the drawer. His arm brushed my side, a simple, ordinary touch, but something inside me stumbled. He paused too just for a second. We didn't look at each other. But we didn't step apart. He stirred the pasta, silent, focused too hard on the pot. I dried my palms on the flannel's soft fabric, trying to slow my pulse. The kitchen felt warmer than it should. The air felt too tight to breathe easily. Eli, he said, voice low, eyes still on the steam rising from the pot, I'm not good company lately. I'm sorry if this weekend feels strange. I swallowed. It doesn't. Not in a bad way. He let out a breath I could tell he'd been holding. The pasta finished cooking and we put together a simple meal: butter, parmesan, cracked pepper. We ate at the small wooden table by the window, facing each other but avoiding each other's eyes for the first time all evening. It wasn't the kind of avoidance you do out of discomfort. It was the kind that happens when you're too aware. After we finished, I reached for his plate out of habit, but Mark stopped me, fingers brushing the back of my hand. Leave it, he said softly. I've got it. His touch was barely anything, a single second, maybe less, but it stayed. Not just on my skin. Deeper. I stepped back, letting him handle the dishes. When I turned away, I caught my breath, steadying myself against the counter. We weren't doing anything wrong. But we weren't doing nothing either. When he finished cleaning up, I found him standing by the fireplace, arms crossed loosely, staring into the unlit grate as though debating whether to start a fire or walk away entirely. You cold? He asked without turning. A little, I admitted. He knelt to stack kindling and logs, striking a match with hands that looked steadier than I felt. The room filled with the warm crackle of burning wood, the orange glow stretching across the walls like something alive. When he stood, the firelight caught his profile, the softness in his jaw, the exhaustion still hiding in his eyes, the kind of quiet strength loneliness hadn't managed to take from him. He turned toward me then. And the world felt suddenly smaller. I don't know if he moved first or if I did. All I know is that somehow we ended up standing close, too close, in the warm flicker of the fire. Close enough that I could feel heat rising off him even through the flannel I wore. His eyes flicked down for the briefest moment, to my chest, where the buttons he'd helped fasten earlier still held his touch. Is the shirt okay? He asked. I nodded. Yeah. It's comfortable. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. But then it faded, replaced by something more uncertain. He lifted a hand, slowly, like he wanted to give me time to pull away, and let his fingers rest lightly on the collar of the flannel. Just a touch. Barely pressure at all. You used to borrow Jonah's clothes all the time, he murmured. But seeing you in mine is different. My breath caught. You felt it? I saw the realization ripple across his face, surprise first, then fear, then something that looked a lot like want. But before either of us could break the moment, the fire popped sharply, and he flinched just enough to step back. The absence of his touch hit me harder than the touch itself. He dragged a hand over his face, exhaling shakily. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. Mark, I said quietly, it's okay. It's not, he insisted, voice tight. I don't know what I'm doing. I stepped forward, not touching him, but close enough that he couldn't mistake my intention. You don't have to know. He looked at me then, fully, eyes searching, vulnerable, almost pained. Like he was standing at the edge of something he didn't believe he was allowed to want. For a second, a single, suspended heartbeat, he reached toward me again. His hand hovered near my chest. Then he pulled it back. I need a minute, he said, voice barely holding together. He moved toward the hallway, not quite leaving the room, but withdrawing just enough that the warmth between us dimmed. But the touch he'd given me, that soft, trembling trace of fingers on my collar, didn't dim. It stayed. Burning quietly, impossibly, in the space where something had begun. I barely slept. The cabin felt too quiet once Mark disappeared down the hallway. I heard him pacing for a bit, soft, restless steps across the creaking boards, then silence. I didn't know if he'd gone to bed or just run out of energy to walk away from whatever was happening between us. I lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in front of the fire over and over again. The way his hand had lifted toward me. The way it had fallen when fear caught him. The way he'd said he didn't know what he was doing. The truth was neither did I. But I knew what I felt. And pretending I didn't was starting to feel like lying. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke, morning light was filtering softly through the curtains, casting gold over everything. My neck ached from the couch cushion, but I barely noticed, because Mark was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. He looked like he'd been there a while. "Did you sleep?" he asked, voice gentle, almost cautious. "A little." I pushed myself up, running a hand through my hair. "You?" He shook his head. "Not much." He stepped into the kitchen, turning away, giving me space to stand and orient myself. I followed him, drawn by something I didn't have the strength to resist. He moved slowly, not tired slow but careful slow, like every action required intention. I stopped in the doorway while he poured coffee into two mismatched mugs. "Thanks," I said when he handed one to me. He nodded, staring into his own cup as though the steam held answers he needed. We stood in silence for a while. Not the heavy silence from before. Not awkward either. It felt delicate, like something waiting to become real. Eventually, I set my mug down and said, "Mark, about last night?" He froze, shoulders tensing. "I know," he said quickly. "I know I made things uncomfortable. I shouldn't have." "You didn't." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "You didn't make anything uncomfortable." He finally looked at me. And the look was full of conflict, relief, fear, longing, guilt. All tangled together. "Eli," he said, softer than I'd ever heard him speak, "I'm not supposed to feel any of this." I stepped closer. "And what exactly is this?" He shook his head, setting his mug aside. "I don't know how to say it without saying too much. Without making things harder than they already are." "You won't," I said. He exhaled shakily. "You think that? But you're young. You're in school. You have your whole life ahead of you. And me? I barely know what my life even looks like anymore." "Maybe that's why we're both here," I said quietly. He met my gaze again, helplessness and hope warring in his expression. "I can't tell if what I'm feeling is real, or if it's just the loneliness talking." My heart clenched. He didn't say it dramatically. He said it like a man telling the most difficult truth he knew. So I closed the remaining distance between us. Not touching him, just close enough that avoiding the truth wasn't an option. "Last night wasn't loneliness," I said. "Not for me." He swallowed hard. "And it didn't feel like nothing," I added. "It didn't feel like an accident. Or confusion." For a long moment he didn't move. Didn't breathe. Didn't blink. Then, slowly he lifted a hand, hesitating just before reaching me, giving me every chance to step back. I didn't. His fingertips brushed my cheekbone, gentle as a question. My breath caught. His hand lingered, sliding to my jaw with a tenderness that felt almost reverent. "This," he whispered, "doesn't feel like nothing to me either." I closed my eyes for a moment, grounding myself in that single, careful touch. I didn't lean into it, but my body wanted to, every part of me wanted to. When I opened my eyes again, he was closer. Not much. Just enough. His forehead dipped toward mine, stopping a whisper shy of touching. I could feel the warmth of his breath. Hear the tremor in it. "We can't," he murmured, though there was no conviction in his voice. "I know," I whispered back. "But it doesn't mean it isn't real." His eyes fluttered shut, like saying it out loud cost him something. My chest tightened with something tender, almost painful. "Mark," I said softly, "what are you afraid of?" He opened his eyes again, and they were wet, though not with tears. Just emotion he wasn't used to letting anyone see. "I'm afraid," he whispered, "that if I let myself want anything again, I'll lose it." My voice cracked. "You won't lose me." His breath shuddered out of him. And then, slowly, quietly, he leaned forward until our foreheads touched. Just that. No more. It was warm. Steady. Honest. A confession without words. We stayed like that for a long time, breathing each other and saying everything we couldn't speak aloud. When he finally pulled back, he did it gently, his thumb brushing once more along my jaw before falling away. He looked at me like he was seeing something he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. "Eli," he said, voice trembling just enough to matter, "what if this is real?" I didn't have an answer. So I gave him the only truth I knew. "It feels real to me." I don't know how long we stood there after he asked that question. The question that felt like stepping onto thin ice and discovering, somehow, it held our weight. "What if this is real?" His voice kept echoing in my head long after the words faded. Mark didn't pull away completely. He stayed close, his hand drifting down to rest on the counter between us, still near mine. I could feel the warmth of him in the quiet kitchen, sunlight catching the edges of his hair, softening him, making him look younger than I'd ever seen him. I didn't realize I was staring until he cleared his throat. Not awkwardly, more like he was grounding himself. "Coffee's getting cold," he murmured. "Let it," I said. A small, surprised laugh slipped out of him, barely a sound really. But it was the first laugh I'd heard from him in months, and it did something to me. Something steadying and terrifying all at once. He picked his mug back up, but instead of stepping away he leaned against the counter beside me. Close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. Close enough that I felt him in every breath. "You know," he said quietly, eyes on the window rather than on me, "I didn't expect any of this. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't ready for it." "I wasn't either," I admitted. He nodded, still looking out at the trees. "Life has been so loud lately. Noise everywhere. People with opinions, expectations. And then you show up for a simple repair issue." "The water pump," I said with a faint smile. "Right," he said. "A broken water pump. And you walk in here like..." He stopped, searching for the right words. "Like quiet Eli. You're quiet in a way I didn't realize I needed." Something warm unfurled in my chest. "You don't seem quiet to yourself." He smiled at that, a soft, tired smile that could have knocked the air out of me if I hadn't already been struggling to breathe. We ended up moving to the living room not because we said we should, but because our bodies drifted that way naturally. The fire from last night had died almost completely, just a few glowing embers left. Mark crouched down and added another log, coaxing the flames back to life with slow, intentional movements. I watched him, thinking how strange it was that I'd known him this long and never noticed how gentle he was in the small things. When the fire caught, he settled onto the couch, leaving enough space between us that I could choose what happened next. He didn't press. Didn't assume. He just waited, something he seemed to be getting used to. So I sat beside him. Not touching, but close enough that the warmth from his body reached me even more than the fire. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "Last night scared me." "I know," I said softly. He looked down at his hands. "Not because of what almost happened. Because of how I reacted to wanting it." My breath hitched before I could stop it. "Wanting," I repeated. He let out a slow sigh. "I'm too old to pretend I didn't feel what I felt when I looked at you. I should have been prepared. I wasn't." "Mark," I whispered. He shook his head, still not looking at me. "Don't say anything yet. I'm not asking for anything. I need to be honest with you. For once. With someone." I waited. He took another breath, deeper this time, steadier. "When you touched my hand last night," he said, voice barely above a murmur, "I felt something I thought I'd shut off in myself. I didn't know I was waiting for it until it happened." I turned toward him fully because there was nothing else I could do. His words were too raw, too real, to meet with half attention. He met my eyes then. Really met them. "And the truth is," he continued, "I don't know what to do with that." I swallowed around the tightness in my chest. "I don't either." He huffed a small breath. "Comforting." "It should be," I said with a trembling smile. "Means we're confused together." That got another small laugh from him, this one a little stronger. "You know," he said, "you've always been good at making heavy things feel survivable." "You make them survivable for me too," I told him. Something shifted in his expression, subtle but unmistakable. A softening. A release. Slowly, painfully slow, giving me time to pull back if I needed to, he lifted his arm and draped it across the back of the couch behind me. Not touching me. Not yet. Just near. A presence. An invitation. My heart was pounding, but in the calmest way I'd ever felt it. I leaned in just slightly, enough that my shoulder brushed his. The contact was gentle, almost accidental, but our breaths tightened at the same time. Neither of us moved away. "Eli," he murmured. "Yeah." He hesitated, then said, "I don't want to hurt you." "You won't," I whispered. He closed his eyes like he needed to feel the words before believing them. We stayed like that, bodies touching, silence warm and full. The fire crackled softly. His arm shifted, letting his knuckles graze my shoulder, not a touch meant to hold, just one meant to be felt. I turned my head slightly, and when he opened his eyes, our faces were closer than I'd realized. Not close enough to kiss. Just close enough to understand the possibility. His gaze fell to my mouth for the briefest second before returning to my eyes. It wasn't hungry. It wasn't urgent. It was careful. Hopeful. When he spoke again, his voice was almost a breath. I didn't know I was waiting for you. My chest tightened so deeply it almost hurt. I didn't know I was waiting for you either, I said. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. In that moment, the closeness, the quiet, the warmth, it was enough. Maybe more than enough. It felt like the kind of beginning that didn't need a name to be real. We just stayed there, leaning into each other, letting the fire burn slowly, letting the morning stretch around us like a promise neither of us had expected to find. And for the first time, neither of us pulled away. Morning eased into the cabin slowly, like it was afraid to interrupt us. We were still on the couch, still leaning into each other, still wrapped in the quiet we'd built. The fire had burned down again, but its warmth lingered, maybe because we did too. I wasn't sure how much time had passed. Long enough for the light to shift from gray to soft gold. Long enough for Mark's breathing to steady in a way I hadn't heard from him in a long time. Eventually he spoke, not moving, not pulling away. What happens now? He murmured. His voice rumbled gently through his chest and into my shoulder, where my head had come to rest sometime between silence and sunrise. I lifted my head slightly, just enough to look at him. I don't know, I admitted. He let out a breath that felt honest, not troubled. Me neither. But there was no panic in it. Just acceptance. Maybe even a little wonder. He sat up straighter, stretching his back, and I followed his movement, suddenly aware again of the world around us. The chilled air, the creak of old wood, the faint smell of pine. Mark looked at me in that quiet, steady way he always did before choosing his words. I keep thinking, he said slowly, that if I name this, it becomes something I'm accountable for. Something I have to live up to. You don't owe me a label, I said. His eyes softened. You might be the first person to ever say that to me. I laughed under my breath. Seems like a low bar. Maybe. He chuckled, but his gaze didn't waver. Still means something. He stood and walked toward the kitchen. For a second, I wondered if I should follow him or give him space. But before I could decide, he called over his shoulder. You're not off the hook for breakfast. Relief warmed me. So did something else. Something light, almost playful, something I hadn't seen in him until today. I stepped into the kitchen and found him rummaging for a pan with a level of focus that felt intentionally distracting. I leaned against the counter. Do you even cook? Rarely, he admitted. But I can make eggs. Maybe. If you don't look directly at me while I try. I grinned. I'll turn around. Dramatically, please. I obeyed, spinning on my heel in a theatrical flourish. He laughed, genuinely laughed, and I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that sound until it filled the room. For a few minutes, we existed in this soft, domestic bubble. No big declarations. No pressure. Just him making questionable scrambled eggs while I made coffee and pretended not to notice when he glanced at me from time to time, like he was making sure I hadn't disappeared. When we sat at the small kitchen table, our knees brushed under the wood. Neither of us moved away. We ate slowly, as if speeding through the moment might make it less real. At one point, Mark set down his fork and looked at me with a mixture of courage and hesitation. Can I ask you something? He said. Anything. Why didn't you pull away last night? He paused, searching for the right phrasing. When I almost let myself do something stupid. It wasn't stupid, I said softly. It felt stupid. It felt honest, I countered. He swallowed, the muscles in his jaw tensing. I know I'm older. I know I've got baggage. I know I look like a guy trying to figure out life 20 years too late. You're not too late, I said. You're here. His eyes flickered, surprise first, then something gentler. I'm scared, he said. I know, I whispered. And you're not? He asked. Terrified, I said with a laugh that caught in my throat. But it doesn't change anything. Mark exhaled slowly. The air around us felt charged, not tense, just full. He reached across the table, hesitated, then rested his hand palm up near mine. Not touching. Just waiting. I slid my hand onto his. His fingers curled around mine like he'd been holding that breath for far too long. His thumb brushed once across the back of my hand, a simple gesture, but it melted something in me I hadn't realized was frozen. I'm not promising anything yet, he said quietly. You don't need to. I'm not ready to define this. You don't have to. He looked at me with something like disbelief. You really mean that, don't you? Yeah, I said. Because whatever this becomes, it doesn't need a name to matter. He stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly, almost reverently. Something settled in him. In us. After breakfast we stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, filled with that early winter stillness that made the whole world feel like it was catching its breath. Sunlight filtered through the trees, scattering gold across the ground. Mark shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. "The water pump," he said suddenly. "You, still need to fix it?" I laughed. "I didn't forget." He nodded, then glanced at me with a small, almost shy smile. "I'll keep you company." We walked toward the shed where the pump was housed. The cold bit at our noses, but when our arms brushed, warmth sparked up between us again, the kind that felt earned, not accidental. Inside the shed, I crouched beside the tools, explaining what needed to be tightened. He listened, but I could feel his gaze on me more than the machinery. Every now and then, when our shoulders knocked or our fingers brushed passing tools, there was that soft, breathless pause. Not because it was forbidden. Because it was new. Because it was ours. When the pump finally sputtered back to life, Mark let out a triumphant laugh and clapped a hand on my shoulder, squeezing lightly. "Look at you," he said. "Saving my house from collapsing into chaos one crisis at a time." I looked up at him. "Look at you," I echoed, actually sounding happy. His smile softened. "Maybe I am." For a moment he seemed to debate something internally. Then he stepped closer, slow, careful, confident in the way only a man who'd finally allowed himself to want could be. He didn't kiss me. He didn't need to. Instead, he rested his forehead against mine, warmer than the winter air, steadier than the beating in my chest. "I don't know where this goes," he whispered. "But I want to see." I closed my eyes, letting my breath find his. Me too. We stayed like that until the cold finally nudged us apart. But even when he stepped back, his hand found mine again, natural, unforced, like something that had always been waiting to happen. As we walked back toward the cabin, sunlight rising behind us, I realized something. He wasn't asking for certainty. He was asking for space. And I could give him that. We didn't define anything that day. We didn't need to. We just walked side by side, fingers intertwined, breathing the same winter morning air, letting the moment be enough. Letting us be enough. Whatever this became, whatever shape it grew into, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't a mistake. It was real. And I wouldn't undo it for anything.